You had a call come in. I was trying to disconnect it. You had a phone call come in.
Oh, and you disrupt it?
No.
That's okay.
I stopped it.
So we're still recording?
Again.
Okay.
Second file.
Second file. You know, he talks about faith, family, free market, and education, and those are things I believe in. But I feel like that it's skin deep, and I don't see that in terms of a robust legislative record. I don't see it in terms of a robust presence on the ground here for substance that Utahns care about every single day. So the first part is substance. Now listen, I'm not the most qualified person in the world, but I do think that I come with a very specific set of skills and critical thinking that we desperately need in a game of politics that has been kind of watered down and dumbed down beyond any remote, usefulness that we absolutely need in our legislative bodies back in Washington, and certainly here in accountability on the ground. The second reason is because I am local. I live in the district. Right now, the incumbent does not. I fund inside of Utah. I've worked hard to fund 75% of my funding inside of the state of Utah. My opponent has funded 88% of his most recent filing outside of the state of Utah. To me, that shows someone who, is mostly there looking at the national conversation and neglecting the Utah conversation in the meantime. And I'll talk about the Utah conversation. What I mean by that is the unshiny, I call it the shiny and the unshiny. We have to have legislators who are also involved in this part of the equation, the unshiny part of the equation. I grew up in District 1, and I grew up in farming country where we care deeply about federal lands. Rob Bishop was our guy. He went back to Washington and decided he was going to be the federal lands guy. Water right now is a huge issue for us here in District 4. I was just down in Sanpete County. They have a water table that's down 30 feet. They're having to sell off cattle because the water rights that they have had for generations on the same piece of property are not supporting their cattle. They're not supporting the agricultural industry that is huge down in Sanpete. Here, and it seems like you've been spared this a little bit here in this beautiful corner, but where I live, hypergrowth, and all across District 4. The need for water because of the hypergrowth that we're experiencing is top of mind everywhere, right? And so these are things that are the unshiny parts of being a representative for people who are experiencing real challenges on the ground that is getting neglected because of the very national shiny brand of politics that I see coming from an incumbent that just doesn't show the local roots or the local knowledge. And the local engagement. I have built a coalition of city council members and mayors who support me across the district because they have told me and admitted it pains us to say that we are deeply Republican, all of us, but Ben McAdams, he picked up the phone. He got the Postmaster General to Saratoga Springs in a city of 50,000 people that needs a post office because right now they drive to Lehigh or to Riverton to ship a package. Ben McAdams did that, and Burgess Owens hasn't picked up the phone. I've won their endorsement. I've won the endorsement of the mayor of Harriman, who knows that even though you don't want your congressional representatives picking up the trash or planning, how your city runs, those are local issues, not national issues. You absolutely need someone who's tied into the conversation so that when, for example, 2 weeks ago, the Department of Interior announced $400 million in water infrastructure projects. And by the way, this isn't like pork barrel spending. This is existing earmarked funding for rural water infrastructure. It went to New Mexico, and it went to North Dakota, and Minnesota, and Montana. And none of it came to Utah. And we're on the ground zero of this historic drought. We need someone in Washington who is advocating actively for the unshiny piece of politics. It matters desperately to me, as a Utahn who grew up, my friends and family are struggling every year to figure out how they're going to put up a profit on the crops and only farm half the land, right? The water levels in the Weber River, where I come from, historically low, right? My sister lives in Sanpete. We just talked about that. 2 siblings actually that live right down the road here in Payson. My family is on the front lines of everything, here in District 4 that is top of mind. That's why I'm running against Burgess. He's conservative, I'm conservative. He's a nice guy, I try and be a nice guy. But that is a very low bar. We have a room full of conservative, nice people everywhere we go. And we have to have someone who's willing to do the stuff that will not get you on Fox News all the time or CNN all the time, and won't get you to all the fancy fundraisers out of state, but will get you accountable and engaged and visible and present on the ground with things that matter here, just as much as the national shining issues. That's the why. Any questions on that piece before we move on to the what? Cool. All right, the what. So what does Jake stand for, and what does Jake want to accomplish? To me, it comes down to 3 priorities. And by the way, I feel strongly that we sometimes allow politicians to hide behind, like, well, I'm this guy, or I'm this person, or I'm going to do this one thing. You know, I don't think that we need to settle for a 1, 2, or 3 trick pony. So when I have, you know, a staff, a legislative staff, and research assistants, and all of the things that we pay our congressional people to do back in Washington, they will be tackling all the issues, not just a few. But I also understand that you've got to guide your focus so that you can be impactful. And the top 3 priorities for me are, number 1, an existential threat to our country, which is a $30 trillion mountain of debt. That, unfortunately, I think our party is just as culpable in building as the other party. And I want someone back in Washington who's going to be a fiscal hawk that doesn't just, it's not enough to go back, by the way, and say no anymore. We have to go back to Washington and say, no, we're not going to spend on this bill, and I'm going to proactively tackle this problem of funding and spending and overreach that is our budgetary conversation right now. Congress's number 1 enumerated job in the Constitution is to be the purse strings of the nation, right? And right now, they can't even pass a budget. Continuing resolutions are leaving even federal agencies hanging in suspense because they don't know from month to month what their operating budgets are going to be. That's not a way to run a country. It certainly leaves us vulnerable here at home, and also vulnerable, internationally to our geopolitical foes. And so we've got to start passing budgets. We've got to start making sure those budgets have a thoughtful proportion of mandatory spend to discretionary spend. If you look at the mandatory spend in our, quote unquote budget every year, it's roughly $7 trillion of spend. $3 to $4 trillion of that is mandatory. That means this is money that we cannot choose whether it goes out the door or not, right? This is service on our debt, and this is entitlement programs and Social Security and so forth. This is mandatory spend because Americans have paid into these programs explicitly with the expectation of getting that money out of those programs. But it's 3/4 of our operating, our annual budget. If any private sector company, functioned every year in a way that 3/4 of their spend was like operating expenses that they, had to spend, they would be dead in the water. And that's the way that Washington is operating right now. I want to go back and I want to do what's, touch what's been called the third rail of politics, to take my life in my hands and say, listen, we've got to stop just saying no and patting ourselves on the back and going home because it's not working. Because in the meantime, we've built a $30 trillion mountain of debt that's going to bankrupt our kids and it's threatening our economy in the short term. So I want to go back and revisit mandatory spend and force Congress to start passing budgets, which it was kind of explicitly designed to do. My number 1 priority. My number 2 priority, we've already talked a little bit about federal lands. We come up against Forest Service conversations, BLM conversations. We come up against the ability in rural Utah to drill and utilize the lands that are owned by the federal government, 70% of the state of Utah. It's a huge issue here. Now, I would love to be the Republican that stands up here and promises you the world and says, we're just going to get full transfership when I'm back in Washington, federal to state, right? That's a warm, fuzzy thing, but it's not going to actually happen. I will fight for that, and I have the mentality that federal lands are better managed when they're state lands. But what I will do is, in the meantime, think outside of the box about how we can work in the current political realities of Washington to utilize those lands a little bit more. I'll give you an example. Geothermal energy is something that is largely untapped in Utah, but we have huge geothermal resources here on federal lands. We're not going to get new oil wells approved, right? I understand Pelosi's, has her majority and Biden's in the White House, but what we can do is say, hey, Democrats, you want greener energy. We have federal lands with greener energy opportunities there. Let's work together to utilize federal lands in a more efficient, more effective way in the meantime that also checks your boxes. That's collaboration, right? It's not compromise on our value, it's collaboration on a solution in the meantime. And then we can, chip away at the conversation and have an advocate back in Washington that is going to champion, state lands versus federal. That's tied to the water conversation we've already talked about. So that would be my second priority. My third priority, I kind of put under the umbrella of How people ask me every day, how are you going to keep your soul in Washington? That's my third priority, keep my soul. And what I'll say about keeping your soul, and we call this congressional ethics reform too. There are so many things that you can do in a creative way to chip away at the soulless game of Washington. We talk about term limits. Now, everyone's probably stood here and said, I'm a proponent of term limits, and we all get warm, fuzzy talking points because it's easy to say as a candidate, but then they get back to Washington to say, but we just couldn't get the momentum, we couldn't get it passed because no one's going to vote themselves out of a job. Well, I want to go back and write a bill that grandfathers people in Washington out of a term limit. Say, hey, Pelosi, Schumer, everyone, come to the table. Let's all get the goodwill of voter support by penning in term limits because it's an enormous majority of Americans support this, right? There's no political threat here, but you get to exempt yourselves, and anyone who gets elected next cycle, the cycle after, the cycle after, they are beholden to term limits. Well, we don't fix the problem now, but you know what we do? We fix the problem for our kids in 10 years and 20 years down the road when people are operating under a term limit. So I would love to go back and do that. I'll just name a couple of other things. I feel strongly we need to get Congress out of the business of buying and selling individual stock. It's not something that Americans get to do on the inside information that Congress is privy to, and I think it's the right thing to do. It'll keep people back for the right reasons. They go back for the right reasons often. They stay a lot of times for the wrong reasons. Let's minimize the number of wrong reasons that congressional representatives stay in Washington. Single issue bills, I care deeply about. Mia Love in our district, before it was your district, put forward some legislation there. She didn't gain momentum, but it's something that matters and something we should be talking about. Single issue bills so that we get away from this business of 4,000-page omnibus packages where no one knows what's in it. And there are 80 things, and you might like 2 things, you might like 20 things, but you don't know whether you vote against it or for it because of the spending that's associated with it and all of the Democrat and Republican initiatives that are bundled together. So those are some of the things I care about and my priorities. We'll spend more time, I think, later on talking about the how and my framework, because I think generally what you're voting on Saturday is a framework. You want to know who Jake is. You want to know the framework he's going to use to answer questions and solve problems. And we'll talk about that in a second. But now you know the who, the why, and the what, and I would love to just take questions from you for a few minutes.
All right. That sounds great. Let's see. Rod, how about we start with you?
You talked about your first bullet, if I'm not mistaken, was the debt in our country, and in addressing that, I suspect you're going to meet many individuals, should you be elected, that aren't honest brokers.
Yeah.
What is your approach to dealing with dishonest brokers? Your discussion presumed logic and rational thought.
And that's where we went wrong.
and that people's interest, or at least many of those individuals, their interest is actually in the health of our nation.
Yeah.
I can tell you, as a person with a law enforcement background at multiple levels in our country, there are many people in Congress who do not have our nation's interest at heart.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, I assume you're aware of that.
Yeah.
And if you are, what is your approach to addressing what I thought were very good issues that are facing us? But I'm just curious.
I think there are a lot of, first of all, thank you for your service. I want to hear more about your law enforcement experience. Thank you. I think there are a lot of unintended incentives to play the game in the wrong way back in Washington, and it translates into spending often. And so I think, first of all, voting against irresponsible spending is the first step, right? I think the second step is to get the influence of the spending out. And the term limits come into play there, because as soon as someone knows 12 years I'm capped or whatever, I only have 1 or 2 terms left, they lose the incentive to do the pork barrel spending, or to spend in the interest of the special interests who are directing many of these bills, right? We have the lobbyists who most often draft the legislation, to be honest, right now in the current political reality. And I think that, it's everything that happens right now in Washington, you can trace it back to like a kernel of usefulness, right? Or a kernel of constitutionality, but it's overblown that by so much. The role of lobbyists is because, you have 435 people back there who cannot be the expert on everything. And you have, Mothers Against Drunk Driving who have done the research on, for example, how often people die on the roads and how alcohol laws play into, fatality rates in terms of alcohol and so forth. That's a lobbying group, right? But they are the subject matter experts, and they have a role to play in versing members of Congress in terms of the data and so forth. But all of these groups have overblown their role because we don't have congressional term limits, and so you rely on their deep pockets, and you rely on their activism to keep you in office because you aren't capped. So I think that, first of all, you can't spend the money. Second of all, you do have to fundamentally revisit the way entitlements are structured. And I think that entitlements are breaking the Democrats as much as ticking off Republicans, right? Because the Democrats are the ones that, essentially have kind of the fiscal blood on their hands in terms of building these programs. And they know that a $30 trillion mountain of debt is enormously unpopular and dangerous for the country. So I think there would be essentially political interest. You have to get what's the political motive, right, in a broken system? There would be political interest on the part of Democrats and Republicans to back some fundamental restructuring of these programs. And then you chip away at the misplaced incentives that are not necessarily tied to spending, but do allow it to be more impactful than it should be. And that's the term limits, and that's the campaign finance, and the stock market trades and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question, but you can't just, I think it's a matter of focusing on the issue, but also realizing the political environment in which you're focusing on the issue and addressing the realities of that at the same time, so that overall you can make progress toward, less influence in money and spending, less influence in outside groups that fund that money and spending, or drive it, advocate for it, and then more incentives for Congress to make the right decisions for the budget. Because listen, it's always going to be way more popular to put $2,000 in someone's pocket than to hit the pavement for their vote, right? As soon as you put $2,000 in someone's pocket or whatever, that's goodwill that, and no amount of pounding the pavement in your community almost can make up for. And that's a broken system. Yeah.
All right, so let's continue. Aaron, do you have a question?
I have a simple one.
Yeah.
If Trump decides to run again, would you be a supporter of that? If he did win, would you be able to work with him?
Yes. If he ran, I'd have to see who else is running. I think we actually have a really good bench of talent in the Republican Party right now, specifically in governors across the country that are doing a good job. Mm-hmm. I would want to see who he's running against. If he won the nomination and he won the presidency, absolutely. This is a team sport, and everyone, needs to understand that. Generally as a party, we want to kind of go in the same direction. But you got to also be willing to kick against the flow a little bit, because like I said, our party has been as culpable in building this mountain of debt as the other party. And so you can't be afraid to kind of call a spade when your party comes to the door and says, hey, we want to spend some more money. So I would, yeah.
We'll let everybody ask a question, but I'm going to let the delegates ask questions first. So those of you who are observers or our alternates, we'll let you have second. So why don't you go next?
I'm just going to ask some questions. Hi, Jake.
Hi.
I'm just going to listen for a little bit and get a little bit more feel from Jake.
For Jake. Okay, floating.
Yeah.
Okay. One little follow-up on his. Somebody said you voted for Biden, but I think they're mixing him up with someone else.
I did not vote for Biden.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that was incorrect.
I was also, it is incorrect. I was also told this week that so I had a challenger in this race back last year. His name was Nick Huey, and HU and Hunsaker also looked. So Nick Huey wrote a big apology letter on behalf of all Republicans that landed very poorly and didn't, sit well with many of us. And so someone thought that I had penned that, but that was my opponent last year.
But my question is, tell me what a conservative is. I mean, I was really sincere because everybody is a conservative, and we're all a nice room full of conservatives here. And then you have conservatives versus principled conservatives or practical conservatives. But what is a conservative in your mind? Give me what that definition is that would be a guiding principle to say you're a conservative.
First of all, I have to apologize that brevity has never been a strength for me, so I'll try and keep it short so that we can get to questions. But I also think that we oversimplify and allow politicians to get away with sound bites that are, pithy and succinct far too often, and these are complex issues. So I kind of generally am probably going to continue to be long-winded because I think that's the right way to go, but it's not politically, usually the way to go. What a conservative is to me falls into two categories. I think constitutional conservative is, and so I think you have to be rooted in the Constitution, but I'm not sure that has to do with conservatism for me. I think I am rooted in the Constitution, and I feel like I'm a constitutional conservative. But to me, conservatism by itself comes down to a couple pillars, fundamental pillars of belief. One, in limited government, and that translates overall the limit of government in a society where we all expect our individual rights to be of paramount importance. And it also translates in terms of how you view the role of federal versus state versus local governments, right? And I love how involved you are in terms of the city council here in vetting and being locally engaged, because this is the level of government that I think is the most important. And so I think, limited government and how it translates in both of the ways I just described. Fiscal and financial responsibility. And right now, I think we are sorely lacking in true financial and fiscal conservatism, even within the Republican Party. I think it comes down to law and order. We are the party of law and order, and conservatism is a philosophy of law and order. And I think it comes down to self-reliance and individual accountability. And I'm sure there are other pillars that I'm, missing. To me, those are the pillars of my conservatism: the self-reliance and the idea that you are accountable for your own outcomes and you can forge your own destiny is inherently American, and I think inherently conservative. And then, of course, the other three that I mentioned: law and order, financial responsibility, limited government. To me, that's conservatism. Now, principled conservatism, I also kind of say principled conservatism, because I think that right now, and to be honest, this makes me, with some people, a less popular candidate, I think we throw a lot of sand that doesn't have to do with the principle and just has to do with the politics. And I'm committed, first and foremost, to being a candidate of principled conservatism. And I'll give you an example. When it comes to immigration, I am 100% behind any initiative to uphold and sustain the laws of our land at our southern border. Inherent in the textbook definition of sovereignty is the idea that you should be able to reinforce, you should be able to, but also should reinforce your geographical boundaries and uphold your own laws, right? And I'm 100% proponent of building a wall, putting in a structure, whatever the data shows us is going to solve the problem at our southern border. But when my opponent went down to the southern border in Texas, he gave a speech about it, and he didn't choose to talk about the policy of the border or even the policy of overhauling the legal immigration system. That is the other half of the equation that we desperately need. He made his speech about the people that we want to keep out, and he used what I would say are slightly derogatory terms to describe, they're coming to your neighborhoods and they don't know your language or your way of life. And to me, that doesn't have to do with the principle. It's not conservative, and it kind of, sounds and seems un-American and derogatory. And it costs us support that we otherwise would have for the conservative principle of law and order at our southern border. And so I'm running solidly on a platform of the sand throwing has got to stop. And not only because I think it's the right thing to do, but also because it's costing us political wins as conservatives. I want conservatism to win at the southern border. I want law and order to prevail in terms of our immigration policy. And I get, frankly, a little bit, irked when I see people who are, conservative distracting from the core principle through this sensational kind of toxic rhetoric that permeates our political discussions right now in a way that's derogatory and costs us the support and the win. Yeah, that was a long-winded answer.
Did you have a question? Yeah, I forgot your first name. I'm so sorry.
Mike.
Mike.
Mike Watson.
Yes, Mike. So, did you have a question now, Mike?
No, not yet.
Okay.
He's gonna get me one though.
I will ask questions.
Yes, please.
So, since you ran last time, we didn't get to meet you last time. We have been in Congressional District 3 and we have...
I did not run last time.
Oh, I thought you said you did.
Nope.
Oh, okay.
First time candidate.
Okay, first time.
Last year, when I was at the beginning of this race,
Oh,
I had another opponent who was also challenging Burgess, but he's the one that...
Okay,
yeah.
2021 you...
But it was before you were in the district,
Yes.
because I think this was it January
Yeah.
effective date, or we found out in November.
Right, that we were moved. So we have had a great working relationship with Congressman Curtis, and we're kind of sad to not be in that district because he's helped us with so many different things.
Yeah.
Just for some background of our little city, you can see these beautiful pictures we have here and our surrounding communities. In 2018 we had some fires here that were on the mountain above us that we were evacuated for nearly 2 weeks, our entire city, and it ultimately burned 120,000 acres. Our city was spared. Lots of prayer and hard work by our local firefighters from throughout the state, as well as Type 1 incident management firefighters, wildland firefighters from the federal government. When that fire first started, I've asked all of our federal candidates basically the same question. You know, it was small, it was a lightning fire. And it probably could have been put out with a couple of guys and some shovels, right? But federal policy didn't allow that. And part of that is the conflict between USDA, which is over federal forest, and EPA. So EPA allows, there was lots and lots of dead growth, right? Dead trees and downed whatever. And that fuel load was so thick that it needed to be reduced, but federal forest policy didn't allow people, and we don't have enough money to pay people to come out and take care of that. EPA regulation says 8 burn days a year, 8 controlled burn days a year. So if a lightning strikes... Instigated
by you or by...
No, by federal fire.
By federal, okay.
By federal forest.
Yeah.
They get 8 burn days a year. So, but what overrides that is Mother Nature. So when there is a lightning strike, it can burn as long as it needs to, right? Without EPA regulation coming in. So it makes sense in some ways that U.S. Forest is saying, let's let it get a lot of that underbrush because we can't get up there. So I understand that there's 2 policies colliding with each other. But at the same time, the amount of risk that got involved there, and yet local, whether it was our governor or whether it was the county or even us as a local municipality, not having a say in how threatened we wanted to be. And when we could have stepped in without a penalty or a huge fine that is larger than our city budget. You know, so how do you feel as a member of Congress that the bureaucracy that is there, we know Congress doesn't pass a lot of their own laws, and all of these policies are not law by Congress, they're law by bureaucrats that put this into place with heavy fines in place. So it does threaten a political subdivision. So how do you feel that you would best deal with those kinds of situations when they arise in our district? Fire is just one small thing.
But it comes into play.
That is happening in our state.
Comes into play all the time. Thank you. First of all, I'm glad that the prayers and everything prevailed and that your community's safe. Was it lightning?
Yes, it was lightning strike.
Okay.
And they told us that it happened 2 weeks before the fire came to our city, and they told us that our city would not be able to be saved. That's the first day. The former mayor and myself were at a meeting, and they said, your city can't be saved, go home and evacuate. We are very fire conscious, so we do a lot of pre-mitigation. We have a monthly fire test, a siren system, and so when that test didn't go off on the first Saturday and it went off on a Thursday, everyone knew
Everyone's
what that
like,
meant.
what? Yeah.
And we also do wildland interface ordinances, so people, we routinely, twice a year, get rid of our dead underbrush, any downed trees after winter. We chip, we do everything that we possibly can, and yet we cannot do anything right on that edge, right on the edge of us. So, you know, that mountain right there, we have part way up, but the federal government has the other part, which they don't even use or want or care about.
Yeah, and they can't even get up to it.
Right.
Yeah. I would say in terms of agencies, so right now, you're right, bureaucrats set most of the rules, not laws, rules in our country. And what I see a case of, you know, something that, like I said, there was a kernel of usefulness, right, in terms of the creation of these agencies, and they have overblown that usefulness by 10,000-fold. I kind of think that, I think of it like a car, right? The last 2 years, we saw the CDC in the driver's seat of the car of this nation. And the CDC has a role to play. You know, we want people to be, you know, infectious disease experts and generally, you know, be thinking about health. We want someone generally thinking about forest management. We want someone generally thinking about the environment. These are, you know, reasonable ideas. And in the preamble to the Constitution, James Madison knew that the general welfare of the people was something that ultimately the Constitution needed to provide for. Right? So I'll be honest, I'm not someone who says, and I see, you know, people ask me, are you going to go back and burn the Department of Ed? Are you going to go back and burn all the alphabet soup, you know, 3-letter agencies? I'm not going to go and burn the federal government to the ground. But what I will do is call a spade when they're sitting in the driver's seat and they need to be in the back seat because they're not elected entities. They're not run by elected people, and they're setting rules that impact Americans every single day here on the ground, right? So I think part of that's a money conversation. The budgets of these agencies have to be pulled back, and you're not going to get, you know, full slashing authority until we have a red, you know, majority in the House and the Senate, or until we have, you know, the veto of a blue president out of the way. But before you know, maybe we not be able to slash right now, but what we can do is try and incrementally peel back 2%, 3% reductions annually from federal agencies that right now are, because of the money, empowered well beyond their constitutional limits. That includes the Forest Service, that includes the CDC, that includes the FDA, all of these others, the Department of Ed. So that's number one. I also think that right now, I mean, the Constitution does say that the federal government trumps state governments in terms of its power. But I think that there's a way to make the case that when it comes to, you know, the borders of our own communities and the way that the federal lands issue here in Utah impacts Utahns, we have to have a greater seat at the table in terms of our state rights and in terms of our community rights. Certainly that comes into play on the federal lands issue, almost more than any other, because you're right, you know, 100 yards away, you have no control over the land that's right in your own backyard. So I don't know exactly what pieces of the bureaucracy you'd have to peel back. I do know you don't probably need the same majorities in Congress to do that, because these are not laws, they're rules. We need someone to go back and actively work with, you know, people in these agencies to visit rules that are impacting our communities on the ground, while we may not have the majority in Congress to change the laws surrounding them. But I think it's number one, a money issue. If you can pull back the money, you can pull back the power of this alphabet soup, you know, federal agency mess. And the second one is you've got to be thoughtful about what you're trying to tackle, and know that not everything is, you know, a law you can get passed in Congress, but you can still make contacts, have conversations, you know, join caucuses and you know, and become you know, form power broking groups about federal lands, so that when you go to these agencies, you have more power and more clout, and you can lobby in an impactful way for communities here on the ground.
And just so you know, John Curtis did form a wildland fire caucus, and so for most of the western state, people are on that right now, but just something to look into.
And joint laws. Right now, there's some meaningful legislation being pushed by some people in California and Oregon, right, for forest management. These are partnerships on the unshiny stuff in Congress that have to be happening, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, sponsoring, co-sponsoring legislation that pushes from people. Listen, you know, California and Oregon, heavily Democrat states, they hate wildfires just as much as we do. And I'm sure they're, you know, going to bat just as much with the U.S. Forest Service as we want to. These are areas to collaborate with Democrats in a way that's true to our conservative principles and pushes back on, you know, the overreach of these agencies in our communities.
Okay. Mayor?
Yeah, so I'm generally tilted against incumbents. I have had a chance to hear from Representative Owens, and you know, there were some things that he said that did cause me some concern. But you know, you talk about the visibility aspect of it. I actually think that, you know, in terms of sort of shifting the momentum, or at least maintaining maybe some forward momentum with regard to a conservative movement, I think that some visibility is a benefit to our movement, so to speak. And I think that, you know, the fact that he's a former professional athlete, you know, there's kind of a coolness there that I think really could work to our advantage as a party. So I'm just curious, what would you say in response to that, in terms of how you would compensate for that kind of visibility advantage that he, I think, has?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between Burgess Owens' visibility and Ron DeSantis' visibility. I think, you know, people are fighting a conservative fight, and they are outspoken, and they are principled, and they're making waves, and they're doing the right things for their communities and for the conservative movement. And that's so rare and so few and far between that it generates news. And if you have a fighter, a warrior for conservative principle, that speaks volumes, especially, I gotta say, like, making a case about conservatism to my age group is becoming, you know, impossibly difficult. And I don't understand why. Actually, I do understand why. And it's because I think we confuse the clout and the influence of someone like a DeSantis with someone like, in my view, of course, I know I'm biased, like an Owens, who, you know, doesn't have the substance, but has the star power, and doesn't focus on the principle, but focuses on the most sensational, kind of toxic fringe of the conversation. And I think that brand of visibility is actually hurting our movement as conservatives. It may feel good that we've got, you know, a representative from Utah who does, you know, make appearances on the national news. But overall, I have to say, you know, the winds of conservatism are being pushed by the substantive, you know, warriors, and not the celebrity, you know, talking heads. So, it's a gross oversimplification. Again, I hate to like come out too forcefully about, you know, why I'm running, but I do feel strongly that I want to be able to make a case to my generation and to a broader range of voters, you know, that this is the type of conservatism you can, you know, get behind, believe in. It's substantive. It's not going to go out of its way to feed ammo to the left. You know, it's not going to be derogatory, but it's going to be, you know, but you can still make waves and do the right things and be the figure that the party needs. Ben?
Yeah, so Senator Lee has been kind of criticized as being a disruptor or obstructionist. Thank you, Carrie. And so I just kind of want your thoughts on that. You know, him being a constitutionalist and an obstructionist. You know, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it actually comes back to, I think, something that I alluded to in the spending conversation. One of the reasons we bring wheat bread everywhere we go is because, and we just talked about me hoping to make the case to a broader range of people for conservative ideas. I do think we've become too often the party of just no. And we need the people to go back, and I just finished saying, you know, we need to be voting against the spending. You need to be the party of no, but we cannot continue to build momentum and showcase, you know, what conservatism looks like in the future and what proactively we're going to do as conservatives to solve these problems if we're just the party of no. I really want to make a case of being the party of no. We can't afford piano lessons. We're not going to go into consumer credit card debt to pay for those, but we can bake wheat bread, right? You know, no, we can't afford to spend this money at the federal level. And I think Lee does that very well. But I also think, you know, in some cases, he's just the person of no. And I want to see more people saying, no, entitlement programs aren't the answer. But, you know, here's a way that we can work with, you know, nonprofits and local, you know, churches and communities to solve these problems that we also care about, right? Just not through the federal government, because we're conservative. You know, I look at the way that, you know, we've weaned ourselves from pension or company-based pension plans to individual-based 401ks, right? That was someone in the private sector thinking, hey, we want to offer our employees more flexibility. We want to get companies out of the business of managing pensions. And so they thought outside the box and they solved the problem of pensions. I'll be honest, my parents are on a pension right now. My dad worked for 40 years for the Boy Scouts of America. He never made tons of money. Every year they have a meeting with the Boy Scouts and they find out how good on their promise the Boy Scouts can be in terms of what they pay out for his pension, right? That's what's happening with entitlements right now. No entitlements, and let's figure out some creative solution that ties those, retirement funds or pay-ins, to the individuals, to the federal government. Those are the type of solutions that I wish we as a party put forward more often, because the no is part of it, but we also have to, the left is saying free college, we all know that college is too expensive, and we're saying, no, we won't pay for it, right? Which I'm 100% behind. But we don't need anything to solve, we don't need anything to say what our solution is. And I do think that costs us support. I think that in some ways, the word obstructionist refers to the person who says no, but doesn't necessarily fill in the blank with any solutions of their own. And I want to be that kind of no and brand of conservative.
Susan.
Well, just a couple of things, and I've already had a chance to talk to you about some things on a different occasion, but I've been listening to these kinds of things for 50 years, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I'm old.
Yep.
So everybody comes with these, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get everybody to come together to the table, and I'm going to do this, that, and the other. And I'm not saying that I'm not grateful that you're excited to go and that you really have thought through things and that you are wanting to implement and change. But I'm kind of like with Rod over here. I don't even think the Democrats necessarily are the stumbling block. I think it's part of the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. How do you circumvent the higher-ups in the Republican Party that aren't even conservative? Yeah. I mean, we get killed more often by friendly fire, mm-hmm. right? Than we do. So I appreciate your energy. I do. And I want you to just go gung-ho, and I want this thing to be fixed. Yeah. But I just, you see things, I don't know, through kind of rose-colored glasses, and then you go and you find out, oh my gosh. And we see this on every level of government, even right here in our state. It's like, oh my gosh, you would think Utah, as conservative as we are, that we'd be leading out in all these ways, and we're not. Mm-hmm. And we're not. Yeah. So anyway,
what do you do for the friendly fire?
Give me a little hope here that stuff is actually going to change. And then after that, I have one more question. Yeah.
I think that you have to be practical about what you're going to get done and what you're not. One of the things that I actually hold against my opponent is, listen, he's put forward, well, first of all, I think he's put forward a very few bills. John Curtis, who you're used to, in the last 2 years has put forward 35 bills. 4 of them passed committee, 3 of them passed the House, right? That to me is like a pipeline of productivity. You may not get everything passed, but you got to put in the effort and the sweat equity to build a pipeline to get something passed. You know what I mean? I think that matters. I think the effort matters, right? Burgess Owens has only drafted in his first year of office, I think it was 5 bills. I think in the last week it went up to 6 because he drafted something about like Russian oligarchs. But again, national issues, none of them have gotten out of committee. None of them have gotten any co-sponsorship from across the aisle, right? Because, and those bills matter, right? Those bills are about conservative issues that we all care about. But that to me shows, to be honest, a fundamental misunderstanding of how to be productive in Congress. You can't just tackle red meat bills all day long and in that number and expect anything to get done in a Democrat majority. And so you have to, I do think, you got to send people back who are going to think outside of the box, be critical thinkers. Talk about, we already have the example of the, the federal lands issue, right? You're not going to go back and draft a bill, and I'm not either, that says, hey, federal government, sign over 60% of your federal land in Utah, every year for the next 10 years or whatever. But what you can do is say, hey, I know your values. My brother teaches, my older brother is disgustingly successful in everything he does. And he's a professor at New York University. He teaches negotiation. And he's taught, you know, we talked about negotiation a number of times in the private sector. You know, you have to understand the value of the person you have to work with. And then once you know their value, you can help solve, you know, for their value and my value at the same time. It's like scheduling a lunch with someone or scheduling this event with you, right? Here are the days that you have open, and here are the days you don't have open because Lee's here or Burgess is here or whatever. Here are the days that I have open. Here are the days I don't have open. You find what the values are of each, you know, player, and then you find out where you have flexibility, and you are realistic about what can be accomplished in terms of where you land on the middle ground. And by the way, that's not compromise on principle. That's collaboration on a solution. I think we've conflated the two, like pretty sadly. The compromise on the principle is very different than the collaboration on the solution. And so you have to be, you know, realistic. Listen, I've been told, you know, every single day I hear it a different way, how naive I am, right? You know, and I think part of that is my you know, age and experience. And part of that is that I am inherently optimistic. And I think we have to have people who are optimistic so that when you go back to Congress, you draft the, gosh, you know, if you think everything's going to die before you get started, you're not going to draft bills, right? You're not going to reach out. You're not going to try to solve the problems. You've got to be optimistic about the things that you can get done, but realistic about finding the middle ground between their value and your value. Some of that's building consensus and coalition through caucuses. John Curtis has created a number of caucuses, right? And then once you have buy-in through a caucus that you've built yourself that has that shared value, then all of a sudden you've got more clout, maybe within your own party, maybe across the aisle, so that when these bills come up, you can say, hey, we don't like that. You know, that needs to go. Or, hey, we really need this solved in our communities. These are coalitions like, you know, with people from other fire-ridden states and other drought-ridden states and so forth. So that's a rambling answer, but I think I hit the main points, and hopefully you get a sense of how I approach that.
Let's let Mike ask a question.
So we've got a drought coming.
Yep.
Right? And you guys may have asked this question earlier, but so what do you see that we can do on the federal level to do that? And what's the balance of having federal funds come our way and what comes with it?
And not, well, and also, you know, what the first question is, how do you, if you're against spending, you know, how do you justify federal resources to solve these problems? The reality is that the drought is quickly becoming an understandably federal problem because it impacts half a dozen to a dozen states, all, you know, across the Intermountain West. And because those states are all experiencing historic hypergrowth, and because those states are all historically agricultural states. And so the federal government has a deep vested interest, or should, if they have the right people, you know, talking to them about this, to try and solve the problem. There's, I just mentioned a few minutes ago, 2 weeks ago, the Department of Interior announced $400 million in water infrastructure spending. And that went to a pipeline to a rural community in New Mexico, and then states across the north, Montana, North Dakota, and so forth. But we've got to have people in those agencies, but also in Congress, who are allocating funds to those agencies, who understand where the problems actually are. I also think interstate partnerships are increasingly important. We draw a lot of water off the Colorado River before it empties into the lower basin of California, Arizona. And those are mostly gubernatorial conversations happening, right, between governors and between state legislatures. But we should and can get, you know, a federal delegation involved in lobbying and influencing. And when I say lobbying, hopefully you hear me correctly on that, right? You know, influencing and pushing for an outcome there on behalf of Utahns. And so, you know, we have interstate conversations that are happening. We have federal funding that's already allocated. That's not pork barrel. And I think that, you know, this is enough of a crisis across enough states that it is likely going to become a federal issue, and we have to have the right champion back there.
Should it become a federal issue? Or should it be individual states working together? What's that breakdown?
I think it's a balance. Yeah, I think it's a balance. If it threatens the national economy, I think it becomes a federal issue. If it threatens the national interstate commerce, which is, you know, directly associated with Congress's enumerated rights and, you know, to regulate interstate commerce. So in as much as it affects our ability to function as a nation, we go back to the constitutional principle. How does it impact commerce? How does it impact security? How does it impact our oil you know, our energy independence, those types of concerns, I think, likely make it a federal issue. But generally speaking, yeah, I think that, and it's also a federal issue right now because it's tied to 70% of our state that's federal lands, right? So if we can get let's say, you know, we got 100% of our state that was state lands, it would be much less of a federal issue. But, you know, since it is, I think, you know, I think that there's a reasonable approach to bringing federal solutions through proper constitutional channels.
Okay, everyone has had a chance to ask one question now. If anybody would like to ask a second one, I think we have time for a few more, and then those of you, we want to be, you know, respectful of your time. And if you will ask us a couple more with the group, and then afterwards they can come and ask you individual, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let's just take one or two more.
I have another question, Jake. Some of us that are ex-military took an oath to protect and defend this nation with our lives, actually, against foreign and domestic enemies. And individuals that seek higher office in this country also take a similar oath and promise to defend our nation against foreign and domestic enemies. How would you describe a domestic enemy?
He hasn't had that question before.
That is a very thoughtful question. To me, a domestic enemy is anyone that is trying to undermine the basis of our country, which means to me essentially the constitutional underpinnings of the country. And that includes the institutions that are outlined by the Constitution and the function of those institutions, the balance of power across those institutions and levels of government, and the trust that we place in those documents and institutions.
Have you not just described the left in this country?
I think in many ways, I think absolutely in many ways, yeah. I would not go as far as to say every Democrat is trying to undermine our country. But I do think there's a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of many Democrats about how this whole thing is supposed to work. And I absolutely do think that there are people in power in Washington and throughout the bureaucracy that we see in Washington and across our country who are actively trying to subvert the Constitution.
I purposefully use the word left as opposed to Democrats because inside the Republican Party we have leftists as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you made that distinction. So yeah, I do think that. I think that threats foreign and domestic are real, and I think we often talk about the threats foreign. We don't spend much time on the threats domestic. And I think that ours, you know, as conservatives, we're rooted in the Constitution in a way that I'm not sure the left can trace, you know, their logic and their policy, right? I think it's our battle to win, which means it's also our battle to lose. And we have to make sure that we have good, you know, messaging, that we're focused on principle, that we have fighters, so that when it comes down to it, we can discern between a sand thrower and a fighter, and we can discern between, you know, what's going to safeguard our Constitution and our institutions in the way that the Founding Fathers meant, and in a way that, you know, many people have given an oath to do. Yeah.
Jake, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Everyone who runs for office has somebody who taps them on the shoulder that says, I think you'd be good for this. And you probably had more than one person do that, and I'm wondering, who was that person that thought that you would be really great to run, that gave you enough confidence in yourself to be able to say, I will put myself out there?
His mom.
I will say my mom was the hardest sell. And this is the honest truth. No one tapped me, which may come across somehow as, you know, damningly presumptuous on my part. Listen, it is presumptuous on my part, okay? So I'll own that. The reason I'm running is I was on a podcast a while ago, and the guy who was interviewing me he works at UVU in the Constitutional Studies Center. And he, for his research, literally, his job is to go back and digitize documentation about the debates that happened surrounding the words that were ultimately chosen to go on those documents. And he said, so the word self-evident, he was highly focused on. In his podcast, he talked about, and he said, what does self-evident mean? You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. All of that, right? Self-evident, and he said, you know, in constitutional studies, he said those words came from Benjamin Franklin. Thomas Jefferson's initial words were, and I can't remember, it was divine and something else, but fascinating conversation, thrilling to hear how they landed on the language. The first self-evident truth that is listed is, you know, the idea that all of us and all of our voices are created equal. And I've got to be honest, as a voter here in District 4, and as someone who grew up with a very real sense of love of country and loyalty to the idea of this country and its institutions, and as a conservative who feels like we're in some ways losing the battle for ourselves, and in other ways, you know, not getting the right stuff proactively done to champion conservatism, I thought, you know what? I call myself a sideline constituent. I think no one here in this room can claim that, by the way, because you showed up here. All of us are in some ways sideline constituents that, you know, shout at the TV, or we see what's breaking and we're like frustrated and we wish, you know. And I thought, inherent in my understanding of self-evident truths is the idea that my voice actually matters just as much as any celebrity or any public figure or anyone. And if I have a set of ideas that I think are going to resonate with my neighbors and with the people in my district that we can do better, then why would I not? In fact, it's irresponsible of me to not try and put my voice and my ideas into the free market of an election to see if they resonate. And that was it was tied to kind of an epiphany that I'm optimistic that in this country, generally, the pendulum swings. You think about how hopeless things looked when Abraham Lincoln was the president. I went back as a kid to Gettysburg and I memorized the Gettysburg Address, and I love history. And that's such an optimistic speech that he gave. And I thought, how on earth to be optimistic in the heart of that Civil War crisis when it was legitimately seemed like the country was going to come apart forever, right? And I thought back, you know, our country has weathered so much friction. I read this book about Washington and how he initiated trade with Great Britain in the days following the Revolutionary War. And it was such an unpopular idea from the colonies that had just finished fighting Great Britain that he couldn't even send his Secretary of State. He sent his Chief Justice, John Jay, to go try and backdoor negotiate opening trade relations with Britain. And it was so unpopular that people burned effigies of George Washington across the colonies. You know, and this is like the most popular president of all time. Our country has weathered so much friction. And I generally believe that the pendulum swings, but my epiphany last year, the day I decided to run, I thought, the pendulum swings, I'm optimistic about that, but if my voice matters as much as everyone else's, my epiphany was that the pendulum needs people to jump in and push it. And so I decided last year I was going to be a pendulum pusher, and that's why I'm running. And if you as delegates can, you know, and as voters can give me the same amount of, you know, opportunity to make my ideas heard, and if you can give my opponent the same level of scrutiny that I hope you're giving me, then I think the system's working. And that's why I'm running.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming to the